What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some highlights from the Summer Games Fest's opening show, talking a bit about the things I enjoyed seeing, because I assume at least a few people don't want to sit through the extremely long mobile game ad portions of the show, so here we are. That said, I do want to remind everybody that there are a bunch of different announcement shows happening this weekend. The big one I would say is probably Xbox's show on the 9th or Sunday, and I know there's a couple things going on Monday as well, which I'll almost certainly be talking about. And considering Steam Next Fest kicks off next week as well, there's a lot of announcements going on right now. But for right now, let's focus purely on this show and talk about some of these highlights. Which is probably a good time to mention I'm not going to cover every single thing that the show announced or went over, as things like fighting games and the co-op shooters were not of great interest to me, but there were a handful of games that I thought were really interesting, even if I might never play them, which is definitely the case for this first game, which is Cuff Bust, which is like a co-op prison escape sim from the developer of Choo Choo Charles, actually. But this one in particular takes these sort of almost koala-esque creatures and sees you escaping from prison in what looks to be honestly really funny. And while I personally don't have the people to play this with, if I did, it looks like it could be a fun time. Didn't see a release date or anything for that one though. But then we have Star Wars Outlaws. This one got a few small snippets of some new gameplay, but mostly this reveal was to mention that on Monday they're going to be doing a big reveal for this game with a sort of deep dive on a lot of systems, so we'll see more of it there. But then there was Neva, I believe, which is an atmospheric side-scroller that puts you in the role of a woman and her pet wolf that seems to want to tell a pretty compelling story with both its narrative, but also with the environmental design and things like that. It's a very artsy-looking game by the sounds of things, but there also will be some combat, as we saw a little bit of in the trailer as well, so there is that. Personally, I think games like these can occasionally be a bit of a surprise hit with people, and I'm curious to see if this one happens to manage to pull that off, and this one should be out sometime in 2024. Then there was an announcement about Civilization 7. Honestly, big 4X type games like this aren't really my personal jam, but I know people do love Civ games, and it looks like Civ 7 will be out in 2025. And honestly, gotta say, the trailer for this was super cool, so there is that. Next up though, we then have Black Myth Wukong. Now we already knew this was coming out this August, and it looks like they just got a new trailer to probably start ramping up the marketing for this game, which, if you're unaware, is a sort of martial arts focused action RPG, as you might imagine, but in particular, it is based on the novel of Journey to the West, and I'll definitely be reviewing it when it fully drops. Now this next title, I have to say that I was a little disappointed to find out that it was a co-op and PvP pretty much only, and that's because it is called Once Human, which is an incredibly atmospheric game, taking part in a sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy meets like almost Lovecraftian situation where some thing called Stardust has come down and sort of polluted the earth, and you're fighting things that were once human, as the name might imply. And this one is going to be out on July 9th, but again, big multiplayer game, which means, for me at least, probably never going to play it. Following that, however, Space Marine 2 also got some more gameplay and things ahead of its relatively soon release, coming up on September 9th. Again, one of those games I think they're just starting to ramp up the marketing for, but realistically, I think everyone is already pretty well excited for this one, so not too much to say there, mostly just more of the same, which is exactly what you want from Space Marine 2, chewing through Tyranids. Then we have Metaphor, which is due out on October 11th. This is from the Persona devs, I believe, and looks to be a JRPG kind of in line with what you would expect from a Persona game anyway. And what they had to show specifically focused on the archetypes of the game that they were called, which seem to be these sort of fantastical transformations you'll be able to make that allow you to perform a role in combat, and they talked a little bit about what some of these could do, and they certainly looked cool enough. But again, won't have to wait too long for more on that one because that is due out in October. Now this next one is interesting because it's not one game, it was actually an announcement of all sorts of games, all of which were from Blumhouse. So each of these games was intended to be a horror title, so they're going to be coming out with a bunch of different horror games, trying to adapt what they do for movies into all sorts of games, and trying to explore horror as a medium. And while I don't know how any one of these individually is going to pan out, I do think they looked pretty cool, or at least had the potential to be cool, because I think sometimes these shorter narrative experiences that are trying to do a very specific thing wind up working out quite well, which is why I personally enjoy games like Pentiment or Sovereign Syndicate. So seeing someone perhaps try to do something to that effect, specifically with a tilt towards horror, is of interest to me. But of course, we'll have to see how any of these individual games happen to pan out, and some of them are seemingly a bit further away than others, so a bit too early to say one way or the other there, in my opinion. And then we have another atmospheric side-scrolling type game with Deer and Boy, which I gotta say is a little on the nose for a title, but Deer and Boy will see you accompanying some sort of abandoned deer in a world that seems to have some sort of dark and mysterious undertones, with certain things looking, spooky towards the end of it, I guess. And while I'm not totally sold on it personally, I do think it looks interesting enough to be something to keep your eye on. Now, next up, we then had a bit more gameplay for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which was mostly to hype it up ahead of its launch later this year, though no official release date. It is supposed to be coming in 2024, and they showed off a handful of new gameplay features, such as being able to drop rocks on people seemingly trying to get into a fort of some kind, or how getting up to no good could see consequences in the world, like the beginnings of a justice system at the very least. But honestly, I was already sold on Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 the second it was announced because I enjoyed the first game quite a bit, so I'll definitely be playing and reviewing this one. But this particular showing was also pretty cool. But then we had a game that I had heard of before, but wasn't super sure what it was even, and this is Slitterhead, which seems to be a single-player experience driven by things like body horror and infiltration. We're going to be playing as a Hyoki, I think it is, which is basically something that can possess people, as we try to hunt down beings known as Slitterheads, which can also disguise themselves as humans. And while this one can certainly be a bit on the, I would say, gory side, it looks to be especially atmospheric, if nothing else, so I'm curious to see if this winds up being anything especially memorable, because the showing that they had here was definitely something. Now, in a completely different tone, we then have Killer Bean, which is what appears to be a comedy game of sorts, where we're going to be playing as a bean who happens to have been a trained elite killer, cast aside by his previous organization and left for dead, only to actually have survived, and now you're taking the fight to them, but also you're a bean and the whole thing is nonsense. And personally, I love the occasional nonsense game. I loved Another Crab's Treasure, for instance. So I think this one certainly has potential to be something cool, and it's actually supposed to be hitting early access this summer, so we should be able to see pretty quickly. Next up, we then have Cairn. Cairn is a sort of climbing simulator that at first glance might not seem like much, but I recently played a game, I believe just last year, called Chusan, which also had a bit of sort of climbing puzzles as you make your way up a mountain, and both the movement of that game as well as the story it told me have honestly made me a little more receptive to what Cairn is trying to do, albeit with a slightly more realistic twist perhaps. And not for nothing, but if I had a nickel for every time a French studio released a climbing simulator, I'd only have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot. But it's strange it happened twice. Getting towards the last few here, we then have Wanderstop, in which we'll be playing as a retired soldier who is trying to run a tea shop in a sort of out-of-the-way cozy town, only to be haunted by the memories of their past. And honestly, normally I wouldn't be interested in this game at all, but apparently it is being made in conjunction with the Stanley Parable creator, and that game was unique enough that I'm willing to give this one the benefit of the doubt and at least see what it is going to wind up being, as apparently there's some sort of twist involved. But while I may never wind up playing this one, I am curious to see what happens to it, which is naturally what we're doing here. Right after this, though, we then had Unknown 9. Now, Unknown 9 came into my own knowledge. I believe it was announced at some other show or something to that effect. But Unknown 9 puts us in the role of Haruna, who is capable of traversing what is known as the Fold, a sort of alternate dimension that people can call on to effectively use a sort of magic. The Unknown 9 universe is apparently being adapted from things like novels and comic books, so I'm very curious to see how they manage to move that into the video game space, because some of what they showed looks pretty promising in terms of some aggressive stealth style of gameplay that sees you like possessing people and things like that. So overall, I'm definitely interested. This one is also supposed to be releasing in 2024, so definitely expect a review from me on that one. Right after this, we then had Enotria, a game I actually took a look at somewhat recently. This is a Souls-like where we're playing the role of a puppet who is trying to fight off powers that have effectively trapped the world in a stasis where they're putting on this sort of play. And it has some heavy roots in Italian folklore. Personally, I'm quite interested in this, but realistically, I would not envy its release date because it is planning to release later on in September, and with Shadow of the Erdtree dropping in just a couple weeks, I think this one's definitely going to catch a lot of those comparisons at the very least. Right after this, we then had the announcement of Alan Wake 2's DLC, which I personally won't be playing until it comes to Steam, but this DLC is actually out today, the day this video is going live, and given how well received that game was and just the fact that I want to play it is what it's doing here, so hopefully it makes its way over to Steam at some point. Second to last then, we have Hyper Light Breaker. Also arriving this summer in early access, this is an open world roguelite with procedurally generated worlds that you'll be running through, with of course a big arsenal of weapons and upgrades at your disposal for you to customize and adjust builds as you go, so this one has the potential to be pretty cool, but obviously we'll see how it pans out in its early access state at the very least. But then finally, to end the show and this video, we then got some gameplay for Phantom Blade Zero. Now, unfortunately, I do think this one's going to wind up being a PlayStation exclusive, as they've been pretty tight-lipped about platforms for this one, but nonetheless, this is an action RPG with, I would say, a pretty clear emphasis on darker fantasy, but also very quick action-oriented gameplay. Now, I think some people have been making some comparisons to Souls-likes, but I don't really see that going on here in particular. It seems much more fast-paced and hack and slash more than anything else, but it does look like some of those elements might be in there as well. Either way though, looks very cool. There will apparently be a few chances to play it, as they will have some demos available at some upcoming showcases as well, though I didn't see any word of things like a release date or anything like that, so we'll have to see what happens with that one, but it looks very cool, which is where we are going to wrap up this particular video. So overall, I would say this showcase wasn't exactly mind-blowing. A lot of this stuff we already knew about, or was smaller indie titles, but I do personally love a fair few indie games, so I still enjoyed a lot of the actual showcase, just, not the ads that it was pumped full of. But realistically, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've got plenty of more reveals and showcases to come, and if you'd like a quick breakdown of those after the fact, at least as they pertain to this channel, definitely like, comment, and subscribe to stick around for a little while. But either way, let me know down below how you felt about these in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.